Lately, the way people talk about Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith has shifted again. Not because one single thing happened overnight. It is more because the story has been sitting in public for years, and every new clip, interview, or rumor gives people another reason to look back at it differently. At first, Will and Jada were not seen as a broken Hollywood couple. They were seen as one of the couples that had somehow figured out how to survive fame. They had the career success, the family image, the interviews, the public confidence, and the kind of openness that made people feel like they were not pretending to be perfect. For a long time, that openness worked in their favor. Will Smith had already built a rare kind of public trust. He started as a rapper from Philadelphia, became a television star through The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and then moved into film at a level very few entertainers ever reach. By the time he became one of Hollywood's biggest box office names, his image was already larger than acting. He represented discipline, charm, ambition, family, and a clean version of celebrity success. That is why people connected with him so easily. Will did not feel distant. He felt familiar. He could be funny, serious, emotional, and motivational all at once. He spoke like someone who believed life could be mastered through focus, confidence, and hard work. And for years the public believed him because his career seemed to prove it. His marriage to Jada became part of that belief. Jada Pinkett Smith was not just introduced to the public as Will's wife. She had her own career before the marriage became the center of public debate. She had acted in television and film, built her own identity, and carried a sharper, more direct energy than Will. Where Will often came across as polished and controlled, Jada came across as more emotionally open and willing to challenge traditional ideas. That difference made them interesting. Together, they created the image of a modern Hollywood couple that did not want to hide behind the usual public relations language. They talked about family. They talked about marriage. They talked about parenting. They allowed the public to see parts of their emotional life that many famous couples would have kept private. At the beginning, that felt refreshing. People looked at them and saw a couple willing to admit that marriage was not simple. They did not always speak in the old language of perfect romance. They spoke about growth, freedom, healing, and personal evolution. For some people, that made them feel more honest than other celebrity couples. But over time, the same openness became harder for the public to accept. The first major shift came with the August Alsina situation. Before then, there had already been rumors and questions about Will and Jada's marriage, but the public conversation became much bigger when Jada addressed the matter directly on Red Table Talk. Sitting across from Will, she confirmed that there had been a relationship with August during a period when she and Will were separated. That conversation did not land as a simple clarification. It became a cultural moment because people were not only listening to what Jada said, they were watching Will. They were looking at his face, his pauses, his tone, and his body language. Many viewers felt they were seeing a version of Will Smith they had not seen before. Not the confident movie star, not the motivational speaker, not the man who always seemed to know how to manage the room. They saw someone who looked emotionally tired. Whether that reading was fully fair or not, it changed the way people saw the marriage. The word entanglement became a joke across the internet. But the deeper issue was not the word itself. It was the feeling that a very private wound had been turned into public content. From that point, many people stopped seeing Will and Jada as equal partners in a shared public story. They began seeing Will as the one absorbing the embarrassment, while Jada appeared to be the one controlling the explanation. That perception followed them. Then came the 2022 Oscars incident. When Will walked on stage and slapped Chris Rock after a joke about Jada, the world reacted immediately. At first, the conversation focused on the act itself, the shock of the moment, and the consequences Will later faced. But over time, people began connecting the incident back to the marriage. They asked whether the slap was really only about a joke, or whether it came from years of emotional pressure around the relationship. The situation became even more complicated when Jada later revealed that she and Will had been separated since 2016. That changed the way many people understood the Oscars moment. What had initially looked like a husband defending his wife now seemed harder to explain. If they had been living separate lives for years, then what exactly was Will defending that night? Was it Jada? Was it the family image? Was it his own idea of loyalty? Or was it the pressure of a relationship that had become emotionally unclear long before the public knew? Those questions kept the story alive, and while Will became more careful and quiet in public, Jada continued to speak about the marriage in interviews and through her memoir. She spoke about separation, self-worth, healing, and the complicated nature of their bond. Some people saw that as honesty. Others saw it as another round of public exposure that placed Will back inside a story he did not seem eager to explain. That contrast became central to the public reaction. Jada became associated with radical openness. Will became associated with emotional restraint. She was seen as the one speaking, he was seen as the one carrying. Again, that may not be the full truth of their private life, but it became the public version of the story. And public versions matter. Once people began seeing Will as emotionally burdened, every old clip started to look different. Interviews were rewatched. Red carpet moments were studied. Red table talk scenes were pulled apart. Social media users began treating small gestures like evidence. A pause became meaningful. A facial expression became meaningful. A silence became meaningful. That is how a marriage becomes a public case study. It is no longer only about what happened between two people. It becomes about how people think love should look, how much emotional exposure is too much, and whether honesty can become harmful when it repeatedly brings someone else's pain into the public space. This is why the latest headlines about Will finally responding or Jada reportedly having a new crush attract so much attention. People are not reacting to those claims in isolation. They are reacting to years of build-up. They are reacting to the feeling that Will has spent a long time being careful while the marriage story continued to move around him. They are reacting to the idea that Jada may still be living emotionally outside the marriage while the legal and family connection remains in place. At this stage, the public is no longer simply asking whether Will and Jada are together or apart. That question already feels too small. The bigger question is how a relationship that once looked like a symbol of modern love became a symbol of public confusion. Will and Jada may understand their bond in a way outsiders never will. But because so much of it has been discussed openly, the audience now feels invited to judge every new detail, and that is why this story keeps returning. Not only because of celebrity drama, but because it touches something deeper: emotional imbalance, public pressure, loyalty, personal identity, and the difficulty of knowing when truth stops being healing and starts becoming another form of exposure. The tension grew because the public no longer knew which version of the marriage it was supposed to believe. For years, Will and Jada had spoken about love in a way that sounded larger than ordinary marriage. They used language around partnership, growth, freedom, healing, and emotional evolution. That made the relationship feel different from the usual celebrity arrangement. It suggested that they had reached a level of understanding most couples had not. But when the separation became public, that language started to feel unclear. Jada's later revelation that she and Will had been separated since 2016 changed how people looked at almost everything that came before it. Suddenly, years of interviews, public appearances, and family moments were being re-examined. People began asking whether they had been watching a marriage, a friendship, a family arrangement, or a public brand that no longer matched the private reality. That is where the story became difficult. Will and Jada were still legally married. They still appeared connected. They still spoke about love and family. But they were no longer living inside the kind of marriage most people understood. They were not divorced, but they were not together in a traditional way either. That middle space created confusion, and confusion is what kept the story alive. For Will, the public reading became more sympathetic over time. Many viewers began to see him as someone who had stayed loyal to a public image, even when the private relationship had changed. They saw a man who had protected the idea of the family, protected Jada in public, and carried the weight of a marriage that seemed emotionally uneven from the outside. Again, that may not be the full truth, but it became the dominant interpretation in many online spaces. This is why his silence started to matter. When Jada spoke, people listened. When Will did not speak, people filled in the gaps. His quietness became part of the story. Some saw it as maturity, some saw it as pain, some saw it as emotional exhaustion. Others believed he was choosing restraint because he understood how dangerous public anger could be after what happened at the Oscars. That restraint created a strange kind of pressure. The more Jada explained, the more people waited for Will to explain. The more she spoke about the marriage, the more people wanted to know how he really felt. The more she described their separation and emotional journey, the more the public wondered whether Will's version would sound the same. But Will did not give the public that kind of dramatic response. Instead, he focused on rebuilding. Professionally, he still had major value. His career did not disappear after the Oscars. His money, business interests and film legacy remained strong. He was still Will Smith, one of the most successful entertainers of his generation. But the emotional image around him had changed. The public no longer looked at him only as a box office figure. They looked at him as a man whose private life had become a public wound. That is why any suggestion that Will is finally pushing back gets attention. It fits the emotional storyline many people have already built. The public wants to see him reclaim control. They want him to stop being the quiet figure inside Jada's explanations. They want him to say something that makes the relationship easier to understand. Even if a headline exaggerates the situation, it works because it speaks to a feeling people already have. They feel Will has held back for too long. Jada's position is more complicated because her openness has always been the center of both her support and her criticism. To her supporters, she is a woman who refused to pretend. They see someone willing to discuss the parts of marriage people often hide. They believe the backlash against her is partly because many people are uncomfortable when a woman speaks openly about dissatisfaction, separation, desire, and self-worth. But her critics see the same openness differently. They do not only object to what she says, they object to the way her truth often includes Will. When she says she did not want the wedding, Will becomes part of that story. When she speaks about the separation, Will becomes part of that story. When she discusses August Alsina, Will becomes part of that story. When she explains her emotional growth, the public still looks for how that growth affected him. That is the central conflict. Jada may be telling her truth, but marriage is not a private story. When both people are famous, her truth becomes public material. And once it becomes public material, the audience judges not only whether it is honest, but whether it is fair. This is also why the reported conversation around Jada's new crush created another reaction. On its own, a reported crush does not prove anything major. It may be gossip, it may be exaggerated, it may not reflect the full situation. But because Will and Jada remain legally married while living separately, any report about Jada's romantic interest is automatically placed inside the marriage debate. People do not simply ask whether Jada likes someone. They ask what it means for Will. They ask whether he is still expected to stand beside her publicly while she lives emotionally outside the marriage. They ask whether their life partnership gives both of them freedom, or whether the public only sees Jada exercising that freedom more openly. They ask whether Will is being respected inside an arrangement that the public still does not fully understand. That is where the imbalance appears. The public has become less interested in the legal marriage and more interested in the emotional arrangement. If Will and Jada are separated, then the question becomes why the marriage continues publicly. If they are still deeply connected, then the question becomes why so many of the public revelations seem to create embarrassment. If they are simply family partners now, then the question becomes why the world still reacts as if every new romantic rumor is a betrayal. The answer is that the Smith marriage was never presented as ordinary. For years, it was part of a larger image. The Smiths were not just husband and wife. They were a family brand. They represented achievement, creativity, emotional openness, and a kind of modern freedom. People watched not only because they were famous, but because they seemed to be offering a different way of living. But once the cracks became visible, the same openness that built the image began to weaken it. The public started to ask whether the language of freedom had hidden emotional distance. They asked whether openness had become performance. They asked whether healing conversations were actually helping the family or simply giving the public more private pain to consume. That is why old moments kept returning. The Red Table Talk conversation did not remain in the past. The Oscars did not remain in the past. Jada's comments about the wedding did not remain in the past. The separation reveal did not remain in the past. Each new development pulled all of those moments forward again. And every time the story came back, Will and Jada were placed into the same roles. Will was often framed as restrained, tired, and emotionally burdened. Jada was framed as open, dominant, and willing to reveal what others would hide. These roles may be too simple, but they became powerful because they gave the public an easy way to understand a very complicated relationship. The problem is that easy roles can become unfair. Will is not only a wounded husband, he helped build the public image. He participated in the family's openness. He made his own choices. He stayed inside the arrangement. And Jada is not only the person exposing the marriage, she is also someone trying to define herself outside an image that may have felt false or restrictive to her. But the audience rarely holds both ideas at once. It wants a clear victim and a clear villain. It wants someone to blame. It wants someone to defend. It wants the relationship to make sense in simple terms. But Will and Jada have not offered a simple relationship. They have offered something much more unclear, a marriage that is legally intact, emotionally redefined, publicly discussed, and privately known only to them. That is why the tension keeps building. Every new interview adds pressure. Every rumor adds pressure. Every headline suggesting Will is finally responding adds pressure. Every report about Jada's personal life adds pressure. The story has become less about one event and more about years of unresolved public interpretation. And at the center of it is one question the audience still cannot answer. Is this an example of two people mature enough to create their own version of love, or is it an example of a relationship that became too public, too confusing, and too emotionally costly to keep explaining? At this stage, the Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith story is no longer only about whether a marriage survived. It is about what happens when a marriage becomes part of a public identity, and then that identity begins to collapse under the weight of its own openness. For years, the public thought it understood the Smiths. Will was the controlled, successful, emotionally intelligent superstar. Jada was the direct, self-aware partner who was willing to speak about the difficult parts of love and family. Together they seemed to represent a new kind of Hollywood relationship, not perfect, but honest. Not traditional, but strong in its own way. That image is what made the later years feel so different. The public did not simply discover that the marriage had problems. Every marriage has problems. What made this different was the way those problems were revealed, discussed, defended, corrected, and reinterpreted in public. The relationship did not fall apart in one clear moment. It slowly became harder to understand, because each new explanation created another question. The August Alsina situation made people question the emotional boundaries inside the marriage. The Red Table Talk conversation made people question how much private pain should be handled in public. The Oscars incident made people question Will's emotional state. The separation reveal made people question the entire timeline. And now, every new report about Jada's romantic interests or Will's possible response enters a story that already feels unresolved. That is why the public keeps reacting so strongly. People are not only watching for gossip, they are watching for clarity. They want one clean statement that explains what this relationship is. They want to know whether Will and Jada are still emotionally connected, quietly finished, spiritually partnered, legally married for family reasons, or simply living in a structure that outsiders are not meant to understand. But the problem is that Will and Jada have never offered the public a simple answer. They have spoken about love, separation, healing, commitment, family, and personal freedom. All of those words may be true in some way, but together they create a kind of emotional fog. The marriage sounds over in one sentence, then permanent in the next. It sounds separate in practical terms, but still sacred in family terms. It sounds free, but also deeply tied. That contradiction is what keeps the story alive. For Will, the long-term issue is whether he can fully move beyond the marriage narrative. His career is still larger than this one part of his life. He has decades of work behind him. Music, television, film, awards, global recognition, and commercial power are all attached to his name. Even after the Oscars, his professional value did not disappear. He still remains one of the most recognized entertainers in the world, But legacy is not only built through numbers, it is also built through public memory. And in public memory, Will's last few years have been marked by emotional discomfort. People remember his face during the entanglement conversation. They remember the Oscars slap. They remember the apology. They remember the later revelation that the marriage had already been separated for years. These moments do not erase his achievements, but they have changed the emotional tone around his image. That is why some people want him to respond. They do not necessarily want a fight. They want him to reclaim his position in the story. They want to feel that Will is not only reacting to what Jada says, not only standing inside her version of events, and not only being interpreted through her public disclosures. They want him to speak from his own ground. But that is also where Will has to be careful. A public attack might satisfy online spectators, but it could also pull him deeper into the same drama that damaged him before. His strongest path may not be anger. It may be separation through action, a quieter form of control, building his life, career and identity in a way that does not constantly depend on explaining the marriage. Jada faces a different kind of question. Her public identity has become tied to honesty, but honesty has a cost when it includes other people. She may see her openness as necessary. She may believe that speaking about her truth is the only way to stop living inside a false image. In that sense, her story is not hard to understand. Many people reach a point where silence feels like a prison, but the criticism has always been about the effect. When Jada speaks, Will is pulled back into the frame. When she explains the marriage, the public studies him again. When she discusses separation, people revisit the Oscars. When reports mention her romantic interests, people ask what it means for him. Even when she is speaking about herself, the marriage is too public for the story to remain only hers. That is the central burden of their relationship. They built a family image together, and now neither of them can fully control how that image is understood. The public has its own version. Social media has its own version. Entertainment media has its own version. Fans have their own version. Critics have their own version. And once all of those versions exist, the people at the center of the story become almost secondary to the debate around them. This is also why the reported new crush angle carries more weight than it normally would. If Jada and Will had clearly divorced, the public would likely read it differently. If they were clearly together, it would be read differently again. But because they exist in an undefined space, any romantic rumor becomes another test of the arrangement. It forces people to ask whether this is freedom, disrespect, honesty, confusion, or simply private life being overanalyzed because of fame. There may be no satisfying answer. It is possible that Will and Jada understand their bond perfectly well, even if the public does not. It is possible that their connection is now more about family, history, and loyalty than romance. It is also possible that the public confusion reflects real confusion inside the relationship itself. Outsiders cannot know that fully. What can be seen is the effect. The Smith marriage has become one of the clearest examples of how public transparency can become difficult to manage. At first, openness helped them appear modern and emotionally mature. It made them stand out. It gave people the sense that they were not hiding behind the polished Hollywood version of love. But over time, that same openness became the reason people felt entitled to keep asking questions. Once a couple turns private pain into public conversation, the audience does not always know when to stop watching. Old clips become evidence, interviews become timelines, facial expressions become proof, rumors become part of the larger record. The marriage stops being a relationship and becomes a public file. That is where Will and Jada are now, still legally connected, still emotionally debated, still tied together by family, history, business, children, fame, and years of shared identity, but also separate enough for people to wonder what the marriage means anymore. And maybe that is the real reason the story continues to hold attention. It is not only about whether Jada has a crush. It is not only about whether Will finally answer back. It is about the discomfort people feel when a relationship refuses to fit into a simple category. The public wants clean endings. Will and Jada keep offering complexity. For some, that complexity looks mature. For others, it looks exhausting. For Will, the next chapter may depend on whether he can rebuild his image beyond the emotional shadow of the marriage. For Jada, it may depend on whether her honesty can be understood without being seen as another form of public exposure. And for the public, the question is whether people are truly looking for understanding, or whether they have become attached to the drama of watching a famous relationship remain unresolved. Because after all the interviews, all the reactions, all the memes, all the revelations, and all the attempts to explain the bond, the story still returns to one simple tension.